My name is Dylan Rogerson. I'm a lead data scientist over at Activision, and today I'd like to talk to you about fun. But to begin, should probably go over my team. I'm a member of the central data team over at Activision. Here's a picture of some of us over in the LA office, and you'll notice that none of our Colorado team is on there because they don't know how to sign a release form, now do they? And this probably isn't nerdy enough, I know, so I went ahead and added a little bit of machine learning on top of that, some Dark Knight Yellow v3. As you can see, we are all technically people, even though I have my suspicions about Eric. And formally, our team is a diverse group of experts with a goal of pushing the importance of... Okay, no, that's probably not the best description. All right, we are massive data nerds. And if you are a game designer, you may come to us, ask us any question under the sun, and we will try to answer it with data. And we do a lot of different things. Work on toxicity, A/B testing, progression, esports, heat mapping, engagement, churn, sentiment. And we've done talks on all this stuff, and I'm sure you could find it online. But as a gamer, I find that there's something important that's missing here. What about fun? It's great that we do all this, but what do we really want from our games? For most of us, I think the answer is pretty simple. We want our games to be fun. Our group, well, we work in entertainment, but we also work in analytics. So how do we go from a feeling to a mathematical framework to an insight? Put simply, how do we math fun? Well, our answer is the Call of Duty Fun Survey. For years, we've been running this in our game, and at the end of the match, we ask one question. Did you have fun in the last match? There are three answers: yes, no, and skip. And those three answers are randomized, and we record that randomization. We also have a back option as well, if you don't even want to mouse over. And our survey is working, I'd say, pretty well. We deliver it in 2 to 5% of matches over the lifetime of Call of Duty World War II, and it's given to every player in that match. Even if they left that match, we still give them the survey. Now, over here, you'll see a graph that shows the percentage of surveys with yes or no as a response. And you can see that obviously if we give them yes as the first answer in their survey, they're more likely to say yes. Same thing's true for no, since we're both looking at yes and no. But if we give them skip first, we still get a 60 to 70% response rate over the entire lifetime that we're looking at here, from November to January, and there isn't much of a decline. So if you're unfamiliar with survey numbers and survey participation, that number is extraordinarily high. I've tried to find decent corollaries, and the best I can see for online surveys is somewhere around 30% participation. And we're hovering anywhere between 60 to 80% on a given day. So I think this is doing a pretty good job at capturing the bulk of our player base. So how were we that successful? Well, we went in with a couple really, I would say, strict survey design goals. So we wanted it to be very quick and very impactful. You just finished a really incredibly intense game of Call of Duty. You probably had an immense emotional experience, and you want to hop into the next match immediately. We don't want to break that immediacy. So we just flash it on the screen, one big message, and you can immediately skip it if you don't want to. We went ahead and randomized the button order. We don't always have yes at the top because we know that that can bias players. We'll go into that in a bit. And historically, we have only ever stuck to one question. Did you have fun? And that's so that we can gauge that across multiple titles and be able to inform ourselves across a whole different spectrum of experiences. And finally, I think what you'll see quite often in surveys is something like the survey on the left, a Likert scale that has 5 different points, either from strongly agree to strongly disagree, or from like a smiley face to a sad face. And these sorts of surveys work very well, I believe, when you have time to sit down and really think deeply about your impressions and your experiences. But again, we're trying to just dip in and see the pulse of the audience at the exact moment of them finishing the game. So we don't believe that adding more complexity to the survey is necessary in order to capture a true experience. So for our uses, and I think what I'll show here today, left, no, the right, yeah, it's a pretty good one. So I think that's enough about the survey. Let's talk a little bit about the game. Now today we'll be discussing Call of Duty World War II, which is a first-person action title. In that, there are multiplayer matches that last anywhere between 7 to 10 minutes. They consist of 2 teams of 6 players for a total of 12, and a little bit of nomenclature we'll be using are score streaks. Now, if you perform actions in the game, helping out your friends, getting kills, capturing objectives, you get points. And if you get enough of these points, you will eventually earn things like airstrikes or flamethrowers or giant bombs that turn people into goo. And we'll see how that affects the game. And what we'll do is we'll inspect the differences that we made in the game in our console private beta between Weekends 1 and Weekends 2. So the first game mode we'll talk about is Team Deathmatch. And in this mode, the first team to 75 kills wins the match. We performed a weekend-to-weekend test. And in Team Deathmatch, we took the score limit of 75 kills, which felt really, really good in playtesting, and we moved it to 100. Now 100 is what is, well, at the time considered franchise standard. It's what everyone felt comfortable with from a design perspective, but we were iterating and 75 felt better. So we wanted to go ahead and test this out. The second thing we looked into was domination. Now, domination is a capture the point mode where there's 3 areas on the map, and the longer you hold them, the closer you are to winning the match. We performed another weekend-to-weekend test. We took the score per kill from 50 and increased it to 100. Effectively, what this means is more score streaks, more flamethrowers, and more airstrikes. The final change we made was none at all. There's a mode we have called Hardpoint, where different capture points rotate over the map, and the longer you hold them, the closer you are to winning. And we performed a weekend-to-weekend test where we changed absolutely nothing. This is the closest thing we had to a control without a true A/B test. And as always, we listen to the player base and we try to get their feedback on what they would actually prefer. But in this case, it was pretty tough. There was a lot of back and forth. There were people who said that they had absolutely solved it with an online debate. There were a bunch of conflicting polls that are obviously highly biased for many reasons. And a personal favorite quote of mine, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, is fans like Dom 50 over Dom 100 according to in-game data, which is impossible. I kind of disagree with that, as we'll get into on this slide. So, again in Hardpoint, we made no changes. That's our control. And what we're going to look at here first is in the leftmost column, we have our change in approval. That's the rate at which you say yes on the fun survey. And it actually drifts down weekend to weekend. Now that's not entirely unexpected. Our player bases change from weekend to weekend, and the players who are playing on weekend 2 are just less likely to say that they had fun on the fun survey. We'll get into that in a bit as well. We see that there's a slight increase in our disconnect rate, went up by about 10%. And our match length went up a teeny bit as well, but there was no change in score streaks. Now the first mode that we were interested in was Team Deathmatch. And for that mode, you can see that there's not much of a difference in approval. It was still down about 7%. But what we did see is a 50% increase in voluntary disconnect rate, people purposely leaving the match. And that maybe a little bit of that is expected. Again, Hardpoint did increase by 10%. And our match length increased by 30%. We made the mode longer. But still, at the end of the day, we felt like we were kind of over-indexing on disconnect rates. They were still too high, and we don't like that sort of thing. It's bad for matchmaking, and it's bad for our players. So at the end of the day, we decided to revert to what felt better in playtesting. It's a little bit of a subtle argument, but I think the data points in that direction. Now, domination was nowhere near as subtle an argument. There was a 12% drop in fun across the board. And our disconnect rates went up by 56%, even though the matches weren't any longer. So what happened? Well, you'll remember me saying that we took our score per kill and increased it from 50 to 100. And naively, maybe this would double the number of score streaks, the number of flamethrowers, airstrikes, and giant bombs. In reality, it increased it by 170%, 2.7 times as many explosions in your face. And so you can imagine that a lot of players did not like that. Now, our most hardcore players who were very vocal on the forums loved that because it was very easy for them to get kill streaks. But the bulk of our player base was not experiencing that, and on the whole was saying the game was less fun. So we decided to go ahead and again revert to the changes that felt better in playtesting. Now, maybe you can't carry this exact result back home, but what I hope this does is illustrate how something like an A/B test, you can use fun as a metric in any one of those experiments. Now, for the next slide, I'd like to introduce you to our new mode, War.
Welcome to Call of Duty Insider, a series of tips and tricks videos to give you an edge on the competition. This episode is all about the latest and quite possibly most exciting addition to Call of Duty, War Mode. Here's the basics. An attacking team fights to complete their mission objectives in multiple stages, while the defending team tries to fend them off. You get to play as both. Attackers, victory is achieved by completing all the objectives. Defenders, it's all about clock management. All you have to do is make sure time runs out. After you've battled on one side, you'll use your experience to play on the opposing side. The team that completes the objectives fastest wins. There's no glory for best KD or kill count, only team victory. Got it? Now let's take a closer look at some of the objectives you'll face in Operation Breakout. Part of the Allied push through occupied France, Operation Breakout is focused on the liberation of a French town with the ultimate objective of destroying Axis anti-aircraft guns. So how do we do that? First, you have to capture. The Axis force has set up a command post in a mansion, and it's up to your team to evict them. The objective is won when the attacking team infiltrates the mansion and holds the area for a grand total of 30 seconds. But that's easier said than done. The enemy can contest the objective, and there are several entrances to the mansion, straight through the front door and blown out walls on the left and right. Those walls can be rebuilt by the enemy, but don't worry, that's what dynamite's for. Once you're inside, the capture point is marked on your screen. Remember, all enemy forces have to be cleared out before you can capture. Once captured, the Axis team will be forced to fall back with the Allies hot on their heels. This will lead you to your next objective, constructing the bridge. The attackers' advance is stopped dead in its tracks by a demolished bridge. In order to get across, they have to build a new bridge over the ravine. How? Talk to your team, designate a builder, and give him some cover fire while he builds. If you look across the river, mounted machine guns, not to mention a bunch of sniping positions, litter the blown-out building. Might not be a bad idea to pop some smoke grenades for extra cover, because it's harder to kill what you can't see. Once you get that bridge built, the defenders will have to retreat once again while the Allies move on to their next objective, destroying the ammo dump. The Axis ammo dump lies at the center of a courtyard surrounded by not one, but 6 entry points. Defenders can fortify their position by building walls at each entrance, but you've got something for that. Once past the walls, plant the bomb on the ammo supply in the middle of the courtyard. When the bomb is armed, you have to keep the Axis forces from disarming it. After the bomb blows, time to move on to the final objective. Escort the tank. Rally next to that thing and get it moving. Don't be afraid to get on that turret and lay down some suppressing fire. Your advance will be stopped if you don't have someone alongside the tank. You have 4 minutes to come out on top of this tug-of-war battle and reach the anti-aircraft guns, thus securing glorious victory. So that's Operation Breakout, which is just the first of 3 War Mode experiences. Be sure to check out the 2 additional War Mode maps for other objectives like Refuel or destroying the comms post. Advanced Intel. Don't forget that this is an objective-based mode that demands teamwork and coordination. You can partially build up destructible walls to gain cover while defending an objective. So communicate and work together. A well-rounded squad has the best chance of success. Thanks for watching Call of Duty Insider. Keep coming back for intel on all the great new features of Call of Duty World War II.
All right, so that was War Mode. And as you can see, we were trying to go for something that was very different than the typical Call of Duty experience. Normally, Call of Duty is about the celebration of the individual. You're an elite soldier, you're the best, you're going to get all those cool score streaks, you're going to capture all those points, and you're going to be an absolute leader. But we wanted something different. We wanted a game that tried to show the theater of war and you interacting with your squad mates. We wanted to create a game that was not based on the individual, but was based on the team. That's a very qualitative design goal. So a designer came to me and asked me, okay, is there any way that we could actually measure that? We could know if we were successful. And I believe we can with fun. But to start off, let's look at some simple observations from the fun survey. And let's go ahead and build our intuition and see if we can get there. Now, for the first thing, we're going to look at server order bias. Now, we know that if we give someone yes as the first option on their fun survey, they are more likely to say yes. And if we give them no, they're the least likely to say yes. And skip is somewhere in the middle. This is great. This aligns with our intuition. We can also look at disconnects. If you end the match normally, you're the most likely to say you had fun. And obviously, if you voluntarily rage quit the game, you are the least likely to say you have fun. This is actually pretty good for any of you in the audience who do not have a fun survey in your game yet, and you want to eventually work on implementing one. Right now, today, you can go home and perform an analysis on the people who voluntarily quit your game. And you can apply a lot of these techniques that we're showing here to show perhaps what parts of your game are unfun, because they're pretty related. But there's a problem with doing simple observations like this. And if we're not careful, we're going to run into them. Now, I grew up in Florida, the land of oranges and old people. And there are terrifying things about my childhood that I'd rather not speak of, but for today, I guess I'll have to allow that. The first of which is ice cream. Now that might not seem scary to any of you, but as a native Floridian, I know that that is inextricably linked to another scary thing, which is sharks. And this might surprise you, but if you take the number of gallons of ice cream purchased over every month, and you also overlay the amount of shark attacks per month, you'll see that these two things are inextricably related. In fact, eating ice cream causes shark attacks. Okay, no, not really, right? Just because effects are correlated doesn't mean they are causal. This is the classic example. There's something else going on here. So we're going to encounter problems like this if we just look at simple observations. How do we correct for this? Well, we're going to build a model to predict shark attacks. And we're going to include ice cream as a factor in that model. But we're also going to include a bunch of other stuff. We're going to have day of the year, temperature, swimsuit used, brand of ice cream, whether that person is named Becky, because I have a belief that maybe Beckys are more susceptible to sharks. And we're going to ask ourselves, is ice cream predictive? Can we actually predict a shark attack with knowing if they had ice cream? For fun, that means we are going to throw in everything we reasonably think is causal and build a model. Now, we can't say what truly causes fun without an A/B test, but what we can do is predict fun and control for confounding factors and bring up ideas for experimentation. So, to do this, we're going to have to collect some data. We're going to look at the first 2 months of Call of Duty World War II from launch. We're going to only look at people who had a quality impression of the game. We'll generate data sets for each game mode. And we're going to create a series of predictive models that assess the strength of factors that correlate with fun. So you might have noticed I started to use a lot of mathy nerd speak. I apologize. But these next 2 slides are deeply technical, and this is for all of the data scientists in the room to show that I am not making this up. For anyone who wants to stare at their screens on their phone for a little bit, I do not blame you whatsoever. But if you would like to follow along at home, some of our nomenclature that we're using are things like factors, which are tenure, performance, button order, stuff that goes in the model. Our models are just another word for algorithms or equations. And the take-home message is that factors that are highly predictive of fun deserve investigation and experimentation. All right, hello data scientists. Basically, we decided to go ahead and do an analysis that focused on the individual rather than trying to predict an entire match because that's more complex. We started with a couple hundred variables, and we narrowed down on most of those using a combination of normalized mutual information, correlation, but most of it was actually building upon previous survey analyses that we've done in the past, but also working with a lot of different groups around Activision to find out what is your sacred cow, what's the thing that you hold to be absolutely true and you think definitely impacts fun and you believe wholeheartedly in. We went ahead and worked with those groups and threw those variables in the model. And then we found related variable groups. So right up here is a clustered correlation plot that shows a lot of variables that are related. And if you have this large number of variables, you have to reduce them somehow. A typical way to do that might be something like PCA or another form of variable reduction. But for a model that's trying to explain what's going on in a way that anyone could approach it, we decided to go ahead and take blocks of related variables. So all of these would be related to tenure. And we picked the one out of them, maybe number of total days played, and we said that correlates best with our target variable, and that is going to be our measurement of tenure. End of story. We can throw all the rest out. So after picking all those variables, we went ahead and tried two different models. We did gradient boosting machines, and we did random forest. Why two different models? Well, different models express variable importance in different ways. So if we have a large amount of agreement between different models that see things differently, we can feel very confident in what we're seeing is true. Then we went ahead and scored the predictive power of our variables, and in a little bit we're going to start inspecting some partial dependence plots. And at the end, we compared all of our model outputs for agreement. All right, nerds are done talking. I apologize, we're back to normal. So here is our first model. This is a TDM gradient boosting machine model. And, so it's for team deathmatch. And we can see a lot of variables and how important they are. Now the number one most predictive variable of fun, whether you said you had fun on the fun survey, is game performance, how well you did in the match. There's a couple others here and we'll go over them one by one. But I want to focus primarily on team score today, that one in the yellow, how well your team did. And I'd also like to add in right now that at the bottom you will see several factors that absolutely add nothing whatsoever to the prediction. Now, in any typical model, I would throw these away. I'd say they're unimportant, I wouldn't care anymore. But I went around and I talked to a lot of different groups at Activision, and some of those variables are areas that people care very importantly about it. And you can imagine that there are awkward conversations that happen when you say, I've ran a very complex, sophisticated model, and we've inspected a bunch of data, and we feel very confidently, as of now, saying, I cannot find any reason or any evidence why what you hold sacred for fun is actually true. It doesn't exist in the data. Yeah, that's the most awkward part of my job. But with tools like this, it's pretty powerful. So let's look at game performance. This is our first partial dependence plot of the output of our model. And as mentioned earlier, partial dependence plots show what our model believes is the effect of one variable or outcome controlling for all other factors in our model. So in other words, this is how our model believes your response to the survey, fun, changes with respect to your personal performance while controlling for everything else that happened in the game. So these are things like skill, tenure, team performance, for some examples. And quite unsurprisingly, you can see that if you did very well in the match, you are more likely to say you had fun. And if you did poorly, you didn't. It's pretty obvious. But here's something that's a little bit counterintuitive. Let's look at tenure, how long you've been playing the game. Now, if you go to a friend and you see that they've been playing a game that they absolutely love, you might go to them and say, hey, you've been playing that game forever. You must absolutely love it. You must think it's really fun. And of course, they said they would. But the reality of the situation is that the longer that you play a game or really consume any piece of content, the less likely you are to say that you had fun over time. Conversely, pretty much everything comes with a honeymoon phase. The first time that anything's around, it's novel, it's interesting, and by definition, probably a little bit fun. And you can actually find out the time frame for which this exists. We see a similar effect for skill. High skill players tend to vote that they had fun far, far less on our surveys. And someone from my team actually asked me, hey Dylan, can you put a line up there that actually shows what the median player skill is? So that red line is pretty much the average player. And I can quite confidently say that the second that you become better than the average player, you become one spicy little jalapeno. That's not me, that's math. Now finally, we'll look at team score. Again, this is for team deathmatch. And if it's plus 30, that's how much your team won by. If it's minus 30, that's how much your team lost by. And there's some interesting characteristics here. I'm going to draw a line on what the value is when you have a tie. And you'll notice, it doesn't really matter how much you win. It just matters that you won. By 5 points, by 30, doesn't make a difference. But it does matter how much you lost by, and it matters a lot. These two sides are not even. I've heard a lot of discussion about close matches being better for players, but I've never really seen any psychological evidence that convinces me of that fact. And I feel like maybe this is one of those first pieces towards that, at least in this game mode for this game. In Domination, our point capture mode, we see a similar effect. Again, it doesn't really seem to matter how much you win, just that you won. There's even a little bit of evidence to suggest that that slight dip there on the right-hand side, perhaps games are slightly less fun if you absolutely crush the other team, even for the winners. But again, if you lost, it matters how much you lost by, and it matters more than if you had won. And you might not be able to see it here, but this is actually a stronger effect than in team deathmatch. And we're actually going to measure the difference between these tops and these bottoms, the trough and height. And we'll show that later. And now finally, war mode. Again, you saw from the video, war mode is a linear multi-objective mode. And interestingly enough, it does matter how much you win by, because probably you're moving on to new areas in the map constantly. And if you absolutely crush the other team, you're probably seeing the tank move along, and you haven't seen the tank move along too often. So that's pretty interesting. Maybe slightly novel and therefore more fun. But again, these two sides are not equal. If you lost, it's going to hurt you way more on your response to the fun survey than if you won. So this is all great, but let's actually look at the results in the model and tie all this stuff up. So if we look at our gradient boosting machine models, and we look at team score moving from TDM to domination to war, we can see that team score is a more predictive variable. And game performance, at least in the final model for war mode, actually matters less than team score. Looking at our random forest models, we see a similar pattern. Again, team score becomes more important, moving from team deathmatch to domination to war. And in war, team score is more important than individual or game performance. So, let's wrap all of that up. We can finally add a third variable on here, and that's going to be the difference between the height and the depth of our fun response. So that's our range of fun response right there. And across all three of these variables, different measurements of predictive power, we can see that team score is more important moving from TDM to domination to war, and I'd be willing to make a qualitative assessment here that war was successful on focusing players on objective and team play over personal performance. So, to summarize, in research, I've seen surveys that take up a tiny part of the screen. They appear far too often to players, and they often take very long to answer. Because of that, players forget about them, and eventually developers don't care about them because they don't produce good results. And they're sent to the UI scrap heap. So my advice to you is that if you want to implement a good survey, it takes effort, and simplicity is key. If you don't yet have a fun survey in your game, there is something you can do right now. Look at your voluntary disconnects, your rage quits, and see what parts of your game are causing people to leave earlier than you would expect. Now, hopefully I've illustrated today that fun surveys can sometimes be taken at face value, but we recommend a modeling approach to understand the relationships between factors. Beware of sharks in ice cream. When designing features and incorporating data, we have to be aware that parts of our game cater to different populations with different biases. Right now, we could look at all of our esports modes, and we could say they're not fun because their fun metric is lower than any other mode. But that's unfair. We know that players that play those modes have higher skill, and we expect those players to vote differently. Again, models correct for this. And in total, what we've shown today is a lot of evidence that some factors are related to fun. But at the end of the day, we want to prove it. We want to make meaningful changes to our game. And to do that, we need to rely on something causal, A/B testing. So, I can now stand here today and say War has succeeded in having players care more about team play than personal performance. Through a series of predictive models, team performance is shown to be more predictive in regards to target variable for game performance that has great effect when controlling for a host of other factors. Of course, correlation does not imply causation. Action which should be thoroughly tested through careful A/B testing. The offer is not valid in Hawaii or Alaska. And we believe the Fun Survey now represents an incredibly strong and reliable framework for understanding the player. Thank you. Oh, and I'll take questions now if you guys have them.